So this video is now on joining our lining piece to our front piece at the neck hole and armholes. So this might seem like a strange step. A lot of you probably think, oh, I really want to sew it up along the shoulder seam first. Now, if you're going to put a sleeve into it, yes, you would actually sew it up at the shoulder seam now. But if you're not putting a sleeve into it, we actually need to do that shoulder seam last, because that's one of the areas we're going to need to be able to turn it all in the right way. And if we tried to sew up the shoulder seam and then sew them all together, we're going to be stuck with a circle that can't be then turned in the right way. So what you're going to do is take your lining piece. So I've got both pieces currently up, right sides up. I'm going to take my lining piece and lay it over so that now I have right sides together. And I'm going to pin this up along, so the main places I really want to match up, I do want to make sure that it is actually lining up along my shoulder seams as well, but I don't need to sew there. So you can have a couple of pins just to check it's lining up, but you don't need to sew there. So I will actually just pop one in there. Should I pop it this way because I'm not sewing there, just to hold it in place. Now, one extra thing I'm going to do, so I will be pinning and sewing along here, all the way around here, all the way around here, around here, so it's a whole bunch of curves, and around here. But there's one extra thing that I'm going to do to this as I sew, or pinning it first, is I'm actually going to just slightly, or not slightly, with a seam allowance amount, so I'm working to a smaller seam allowance, I'm actually going to fold down just the lining edge all the way around, or to just along where the shoulder seams are. So that'll be in 4 places. I'm actually going to have that pinned downwards. So there. Also going to do it here. So a seam allowance amount folded downwards. And that little notch keeps getting in the way, so I'll pin that down as well. Okay, so I'd also be doing that to this side and this side too. And then I can keep pinning around my armhole. And when I sew this, I'll show you over at the sewing machine. I will actually sew, so I'm not sewing along here. So I've gone off camera there, haven't I? I'm not sewing along here, but I will actually sew it down when I come along to this part. And you'll understand why a bit later when we do actually come to sew up our shoulder seams together. It'll all make sense. All right, so I'll pause the video here, I'll finish pinning, and I'll take you over to the sewing machine. So just before I start sewing, I did want to point out that it would have been a really good time before you actually pinned all of this up. So hopefully you're watching this video first and you haven't started pinning it. But before you pin all this up, actually do a fitting with your pieces, and you just temporarily would pin them at the shoulder seams for that fitting, just to check that the bust darts, the back darts, and the side seams are actually in the right place and it's all fitting well. So then you can go and make any changes that you need to before you join the pieces together, and make sure that any changes that you make to the good fabric are made to the lining as well. Okay, so I'm going to sew around all of these, and just a reminder that when I come to this folded bit, I'm not actually going to sew over it, so I'm not actually going to sew along that fold, but I am going to sew over where it is folded. And just again, because I'm working with such a small piece, I'm just putting my length down a little bit. Okay, so hopefully see the camera is probably struggling to pick up the white on white there. I should have done it with a different colour to it. I'll move this back a bit so you can see a little bit more. Alright, so there's one, so I'm going to do several different stitches along here. So when I come to my armhole, so this is my first armhole, I can take this pin out if it's a little bit in my way. I'm going to make sure that that bit stays down, so if I'm blocking it with my finger from the camera, I'm going to make sure that that stays folded down a seam allowance amount. Now when I sew around a curve, I'm going to make sure I keep curving my machine around so I stay that same seam allowance away from the edge all the time. And you can take your time to go slowly around the bits that are a bit more curved. My next step before I turn it out the right way is that I'm actually going to clip those curves. So several of you, if you've made the shorts before, or also a few things that we did with the hoodie, we will have done some clipping of our seams. Wherever you have a curved seam, you always want to clip into it, because if you imagine a racetrack, it's bigger on the outside. So when this, hopefully I'll show you from here, it might actually show where that stitching line is. So if you imagine this is a racetrack, obviously it's bigger around here, but when it gets turned in the other way, this is going to have to be the biggest edge and take up more of the circumference. So by clipping into that up to the seam, we're actually going to let it flare, sort of fan out, so that it can travel around that distance. Right, so I'll just do the neckline as well so that you can see that, and then I'll pause the video for a second because you don't need to see me doing all of these seams, and I will show you clipping it and turning it out. Keeping really even along here, as you would keep even along everywhere. If you find you have an area that's quite sudden curve, it's okay to lift up your machine, so lift up your presser foot a little bit while that needle's down to help it curve. Because you don't want to do it on too extreme of an angle, otherwise you are going to suddenly get a bit of a point. It's okay if you want to do it that way. Take my pin out as I come up to it, and back stitch. Alright, so I'll pause the video for a moment, and I'll sew up the last armhole and then the other bit of the back neckline, and then I will show you turning it all in, or clipping it and turning it all in the right way. So I've got that all sewn up now, and it should be stitched over these folded bits here. Before I turn it in the right way, I'm going to clip into all of these seams that I've just sewn, particularly around the most curved bits, but I can clip around the whole thing as well. So when I put clips in, I'm just clipping up to, can be just short of where that stitching line is. Particularly important to clip more, so it's not so drastic where it's straight there, but anywhere where it's quite curved, you really need to make sure you've got more clips in there, because that's the area that needs more help to sit nicely when it's turned in the right way. As I tried to hopefully explained okay before, that racetrack analogy, what's currently the smallest circumference around the center of the circle, when it gets turned inside out, is going to be the biggest circumference, so it needs to be able to flare out so that it can do that. So clipping all the way around here. If you had a V neckline, you'd also just need to clip a little bit further, obviously not going over your stitching line, but you do need to have, clip right down to the point, and kind of clip next to the point as well. It's a good time to just check that you've trimmed off all your loose threads as well, because loose threads are a sign of bad quality control. This isn't the only way to make a dress. There are hundreds of ways to make a dress, or there's definitely about, say 20 ways that you can make a simple, fitted dress like this that's in non-stretchy fabric. But this is a good basic way that also allows you to do the majority of the work on the sewing machine, so you're not having to do as much hand sewing. Which, if you're lazy like me, that can be a good thing. So I've clipped all of my seam allowance, and now I can turn the whole thing in the right way. So if I hadn't left those shoulder seam bits open and I'd sewn them up, I wouldn't actually be able to turn this in. Also, if you've done your shoulder seams too small, that will be very difficult to turn in the right way. Okay, so you can kind of see now how I'm going to have a nice edge around there, but of course I want to go and iron that. I'm actually going to take you over to the iron and show you ironing this out, because I'm going to give it a slight roll as I iron. So I'll pause the video for a second and head over to the iron. So as I'm about to iron, I do want to make sure that I have it fully pulled all the way out to the seam, like this. If you're using, probably a good time to mention, if you're using a highly synthetic fabric, please do use a pressing cloth over this. You don't want to melt your fabric. So I'm going to iron this down like this, and I'm going to iron it with a very, very slight roll, which means that I'm slightly rolling my good fabric around to my lining side. Now, another technique that we could do on this is doing what's called an understitch. But this is a very simple pattern, so we actually I don't feel we need an understitch on that. That would actually have been going around first and actually sewing down my seam allowance to one side of my fabric. But I don't think it's necessary to do for this particular one. So I'm also going to iron down, remember that fold that we put in? I'm actually going to iron that down too as I'm going around, making sure that I'm pulling it all out the right way, and that it's very, very slightly rolling to my lining side. And the great thing about having slightly see-through fabric is that you can hopefully see from the inside where that seam allowance that I've clipped is fanning out. So you can see the areas where it really needed it. You know, look at that one where it's really had to fan out a lot. So it was a very important thing to do. Okay, make sure that you completely pull it out all the way before you iron it down. If you try and roll it too much, you'll find that you've got too much lining, and the lining will just sort of have to buckle. Fold that bit down. It's got a little, ironed a little press, a little fold into it. It's better. Keep turning it out correctly, because I want it to be fully pulled outwards. And ironing it with that very slight roll. Finding this, because I'm sort of ironing it from this side, I'm naturally doing that roll anyway. It didn't do it very well there, so I'm just going to go back into that bit and get a little bit more of a roll there. Sorry if I'm blocking it with my hands. Again, there's the top. Fold it down. And all around the second armhole. Like this. After this step's probably another great time to do a little fitting. Making sure that everything's sitting well before we move on to sewing up those shoulder seams. Okay, and last little bit. It's just around here. And the ironing is done. So when that's all turned around the right way, you can start to see how it's looking really nice. Oh, sorry, I can't see on camera. So start to see how it's looking nicely finished around that nicely ironed and lined edge there. So we're going to stop this video here. So that is doing your sewing your bodice together to the lining. So your good piece and your lining piece of the bodice around the armholes and the neckline. And next we're going to move on to doing the shoulder seam. So I'll do a different video for that one. So bye for now.